Salty, sweet, bitter, sour, and umami. These are the 5 core tastes recognized by chefs all over the world, and they have almost nothing to do with video games. When I was a kid, I grew up on my dad's cooking. Complex, rich, and sometimes overly seasoned curries. That food was my childhood. It shaped my palate, but not in the simple, I grew up with Indian food, so now I crave Indian food kind of way. Instead, it helped me to appreciate layered flavors, to chase spice, richness, and heat. These days, Thai food is probably my favorite, but that foundational taste still lingers. The same thing has happened with games. I played a lot of them as a kid, but 2 titles stood out and still influence how I engage with games today. Pokemon Emerald on the Game Boy, which taught me how to read, but more relevant to this video, Ratchet & Clank on the PlayStation 2. I adored it. It was chaotic, creative, and full of weird, wonderful tools to play with. Food and games are obviously very different, but the way they shaped me, the way I learned to taste both, feels oddly similar. And it all ties back to a lesser known, often misunderstood 6th flavor: nostalgia. When I say nostalgia, I don't just mean remembering the good old days. I'm using it in a more nuanced way. Nostalgia as a flavor, shaped by the art we grew up with, and carried forward into the things we love today. I'll be upfront, I've never played a classic Doom game. My relationship with the series starts in 2016, but I grew up playing Ratchet & Clank after school. Chaotic weapons, emphasis on movement, waves of enemies. And when I played Doom: The Dark Ages, it tasted like that. Not literally, of course, but in that deeper, visceral way. The way your past shapes your present. If I had grown up with Harvest Moon or StarCraft, I probably wouldn't have felt the same way. And that's part of why I'm making this video. A lot of the criticism around Doom: The Dark Ages doesn't reflect the experience I had, and to explain why this game hit so hard for me, and why it might have for others as well, I need to reckon with that dissonance. For that, I'll be talking about Doom 2016, Eternal, and The Dark Ages in detail. Full spoilers ahead. Before anything else, I want to break down what I call the Doom fantasy, a design pillar that runs through every title, and explain how The Dark Ages builds on it. That way, even if you haven't played this $120 graphics card melting monster, we're on the same page. The Doom fantasy is about extreme empowerment, the fantasy of being the Slayer, mowing down wave after wave of demons with uninterrupted, righteous fury. That power is mostly delivered through narrative and aesthetic, but what these games do brilliantly is reinforce it through mechanics. When everything clicks, music blasting, your weapon cycling in perfect time with your thoughts, you enter a kind of flow state. Instinct takes over, you stop planning and start reacting. You're choosing the perfect weapon for each micro scenario before you even realize it. It becomes a rhythm, a violent, beautiful rhythm that fuses the idea of Doom with the feel of it. The narrative fantasy and the gameplay fantasy become one. The Dark Ages absolutely nails this feeling, and in some ways even refines it beyond what Eternal accomplished. There are key additions, most notably the shield. It's not just for blocking, it's your best friend from the start all the way until the end. With it, you can parry telegraphed attacks within a generous window, shield charge enemies to close distance or deal AoE damage, and launch it as a saw blade to stagger larger threats or clear fodder. These tools aren't gimmicks, they're baked into the game's rhythm. They add new beats to the combat loop without disrupting what Doom is supposed to feel like. The game also adds 3 major features outside of traditional Doom combat: a proper narrative, dragon riding segments, and mech piloting. Unlike previous titles where the story took a backseat, this one pushes it forward, almost placing it on equal footing with gameplay. It has been met with a lot of scrutiny, and I've got plenty to say about it, but we'll come back to that. As for the new gameplay sections, I think they're primarily designed to manage pacing. If every level was just a sprawling shooting gallery, things would start to blur together. The dragon segments and the Atlan mech moments break that up with spectacle, but how well that works depends on what you're looking for. A lot of people seem to prefer the dragon levels, but I actually felt the opposite. They have you fly between waypoints, complete small rhythm minigames, and then drop into bite-sized Doom arenas. It felt more like filler to me than flair. The Atlan sections, on the other hand, lean fully into cinematic fantasy. You're not there to be challenged, you're there to stomp across buildings, crush titans, and feel unstoppable. It's essentially a playable cutscene, and I had a blast in every level that included them. The core play pattern in the Dark Ages mirrors what came before in 2016 and Eternal. You start with a small set of tools, simple yet familiar, and as the game ramps up, new ones are introduced incrementally. Each time you adapt, and by the end, you'll have a deep understanding of each tool's purpose. However, to combat this increase in power, the game is consistently throwing harder enemies into the mix to match you. Levels are focused and well designed, often hiding secrets, and each level serving up a variety of combat encounters. These fights mix enemy types in ways that feel almost like puzzles. You need to identify which threats to prioritize and which tools are best for each. Often the best answer is to be as aggressive as you can be. The Doom loop rewards pushing forward. Health comes from kills, so putting yourself into the thick of it is usually the smartest move. But thanks to how flexible each weapon is, and how open most arenas are, no two players fight the same way. Everyone develops their own heuristics, their own rhythm, their own playstyle. These puzzle sandbox arenas are the meat and potatoes of Doom, and the additions in the Dark Ages, like the dragons, mechs, and story segments, go a long way in keeping that core loop from turning stale. I think that's a huge win. There's still more to talk about, secrets and a deeper dive into combat, but we'll get there. Unfortunately, not everyone had as pleasant an experience with this game as I did. For the first time in this new wave of Doom games, reception hasn't been universally positive. Honestly, I think a lot of it is overblown. However, in the spirit of good faith, I want to steelman 3 criticisms I've seen levied across reviews and breakdowns, and offer a different perspective. First, pricing, playtime, and performance. Doom the Dark Ages launched at 120 Aussie dollars, which struck a lot of people as steep for a 15-hour campaign. Add in the high system requirements and reports of crashes, or even being unable to launch the game, and it's easy to see why some players were upset. Personally, I'd take a polished, well-crafted, 15-hour experience over a bloated 50-hour slog. And when you factor in the replay value, multiple difficulties, varied weapons, and combat sandbox, the pricing seems more reasonable. As for performance, I can only speak for my own setup, but I didn't run into any crashes or frame rate dips. That's obviously not true for everyone, but I don't think fixable technical issues should weigh too heavily on the game's merits as art. Just be wary of your setup, and hopefully you get the chance to experience this game. Second, the story. The criticism I've seen around the story comes from 2 main angles. First, some people feel that a series like Doom, known for its over-the-top violence and fast-paced gameplay, should either keep the story minimal or ensure it matches the tone, punchy, irreverent, and non-intrusive. In their eyes, a heavier narrative risks distracting from the core experience. The second criticism isn't about the idea of story itself, but the execution. These critics argue that the Dark Ages introduces too many plot holes, tonal inconsistencies, or overly dramatic moments that just don't land. From this angle, the issue isn't that there is a story, it's that the story isn't strong enough to justify its expanded presence. And because it's been given more attention in this game, it drags the experience down. Warning: subjectivity inbound. Why does Dungeons & Dragons combat work? On paper, it's a mess. The mechanics are clunky, you have to imagine everything yourself, and even in games like Baldur's Gate, it's overwhelming for newcomers. But the reason it works, the reason people care, is because there's narrative context. There are characters, stakes, and a world you're invested in. That story gives weight to every dice roll. I see it the same way in Doom. Story, when used well, doesn't compete with gameplay, it amplifies it. Just because a game doesn't take itself too seriously doesn't mean it shouldn't have a story. Focus on combat and include narrative aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, I think the best games do both. But maybe the Dark Ages takes itself too seriously. I'd argue the opposite, especially compared to Doom 2016 and even Eternal to some extent. Yes, there are some over-the-top moments, some dramatic line deliveries that don't land. But to me, it all reads as self-aware. I find it hard to believe anyone thinks this game is genuinely playing it straight when one of the major plot points is that you escape from Cthulhu, literally Cthulhu, by killing yourself, going to hell, and climbing back out as a zombie. That's real. That's canon. And it's not the only example. The whole narrative has this don't think too hard about this energy that fits perfectly with Doom's core vibe. It's campy power fantasy, and honestly, I had fun with it. I'll be fair though, there were a few moments early on that made me cringe. Some reveals, some lines that didn't land, but by the end, I was super into it. As for the story itself, I think it's more than serviceable, especially if you've played the previous games. It adds context to the timeline in a way that actually made me appreciate the older titles more, even without playing the classics. Let's do story time real quick, just so we're all on the same page in case you haven't played. There are 3 main factions in the Dark Ages: the Sentinels, the Makers, and the Demons. Good guys, middle guys, and bad guys respectively. The Demon Prince Azrak wants to steal a powerful artifact from the Sentinels to make himself basically unstoppable. The Makers are playing the middle. They're currently using the Slayer as a tool to protect themselves, and occasionally the Sentinels when it benefits them. So for now, the Slayer's under their control. There's a full-blown war between the Sentinels and the Demons over this artifact, until the Demons figure out the artifact is actually inside one of the Sentinel side characters. They convince the Makers to switch sides, and together they capture her. You, as the Slayer, chase her down to save the day, but the plot needs you to lose this one. You're captured, hope seems lost. Then, cue the suicide mission, the Hell prison break, and your glorious return. You fight your way back, 1v1 Azrak after he becomes a demigod. You're losing until, in classic shonen anime fashion, he kills your dragon, you snap, show him the consequences, and force him to retreat to hell. Then you and the squad roll in after him to finish the job. I'm obviously glazing over a lot here, but that's the gist. It's a simple story told simply, not some ambiguous, multi-layered masterpiece. But that clarity is not only appropriate for the tone of Doom, but a huge break from prior titles. Now for the final outside criticism. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Doom Eternal is an amazing game, but the Dark Ages changes a lot, inside and outside of combat. Glory kills are de-emphasized, your movement options are different, the core combat philosophy shifts from run and gun to stand and fight. Even the tone of the story changes. And for some players, every one of these changes feels like a downgrade. The thinking goes, Eternal worked. It was tight, fast, and fun. So why mess with that? Why take what was awesome and turn it into something slower and clunkier? That's not an unreasonable reaction, but for me, it's a red flag. Different doesn't automatically mean worse. What I see instead is people expecting this game to be worse because it's not Eternal, going in ready to pounce on anything that feels unfamiliar. This isn't like Eternal, therefore it's bad. I can empathize if someone genuinely didn't enjoy the new approach, but that's not the tone I get from most criticisms I've seen. Let's start with an easy one, the glory kills. One purpose of the glory kill is to give you a breather in the chaos, to let you reposition and strategize. It also adds a layer of spectacle to the combat. But let's be real, by hour 5 in Eternal and 2016, the novelty wears off. The kills start to feel more like interruptions rather than rewards. The pacing stalls, especially when you're deep in the groove of an intense fight. So the change here, from long flashy animations to near instant kills, might seem underwhelming at first, but in the mid to late game, it keeps the fights smooth, fast, and fun. Less friction, more flow. As for the rest of the combat changes, that's more about personal taste. I'll dig into that when I talk about what the Dark Ages nails, but I genuinely think if you go in with an open mind about the stand and fight design, there's a lot to appreciate. Take the ambushes for example. The game loves to place goodies in seemingly safe spots, only to spring enemy combinations on you that feel almost strategic, like the demons are setting up traps to gain the upper hand. But in keeping with the game's ethos of empowerment, these fights are rarely punishing. They're indulgent. They exist to let you flex. The best of these are the varied Hell Knight brawls. Hell Knights are big, burly demons with slow, highly telegraphed melee attacks that can be parried. Occasionally, the game throws a whole squad at you, and it's your job to manage spacing, time your parries, and dismantle them with style. Once it clicks, these fights feel like something out of a kung fu movie. Surrounded but unfazed, turning chaos into choreography. After every one of these sequences, I'd end up scribbling barely legible, overexcited praise in my notebook. Just pure soy-fueled gushing about how good the combat felt. Now, contrary to what you might think, after I've basically pushed back on every major criticism, is that I do have some real problems with this game. Two big ones actually, and they're not new. These issues have been lurking since 2016, and they're still here in the Dark Ages. The first is a bit personal and probably very different from the perspective of full-time YouTube reviewers who played this from early access keys. Yes, I'm a little salty about that. The amount of focus this game demands, especially on harder difficulties, is brutal. For me, it just isn't sustainable. If you've worked a full day, then sit down and try to play this for 2 hours straight, your brain turns to mush. And when that happens, getting stuck in a tough combat encounter becomes maddening. You're not processing fast enough, you keep dying, and the frustration stacks. It clashes with that Doom fantasy I mentioned earlier. The Slayer shouldn't feel like he's getting clowned by demons every 5 minutes. You should feel like a sickle cutting through a field. Now, I've seen people saying this game is too easy. Maybe I'm just dogshit or missing something, but I played through on Ultraviolence and Nightmare without touching the sliders, and I definitely got challenged. Is it the hardest game ever? No, but I also don't think it's supposed to be. The second problem I have, and easily the biggest, is the secrets. We're talking figurines, codex entries, collectibles, the usual suspects. In theory, these could fit into that Doom fantasy I've been talking about. You launch into a new area, rip and tear everything in sight, and move on like some heroic monstrosity. But that fantasy unravels the second you see the little pop-up on your interface. Secrets found, 0. Suddenly you're not the Slayer anymore. You're a Roomba. Methodically checking every corner, crawling along the walls, scanning for goodies. And look, in exploration-heavy games like Breath of the Wild or Skyrim, that's part of the appeal. But in Doom, it's a tonal mismatch. This mutated structure, this stop-start rhythm of combat, treasure hunt, combat, has plagued the series since 2016. It wrecks the pacing, it kills immersion. Now, the Dark Ages does make a few adjustments. Some good, some not so good. For example, the automap used to be something you had to earn. Now it's handed to you at the start of every level, showing rough positions for nearly every secret. In theory, that's helpful. Less aimless wandering, more guided searching. But it doesn't solve the real problem. If anything, it amplifies it. Every minute or two, you're checking your map again, zooming in, flipping angles, instead of flowing from one arena to the next. The Doom rhythm stutters, constantly interrupted by a mental checklist. And that's not even the worst part. Some secrets aren't on the automap. Things like wolf puzzles or obscured environmental triggers. I use puzzle lightly. These aren't moments of clarity or cleverness, they're notice a thing moments. There's a tiny pressure valve you have to interact with. There's a wolf you only see if you tilt your camera just right. There's no aha click of understanding, just a vague sense of, what does the game want me to notice now? Let me reiterate. This is the antithesis of that Doom fantasy. It's not power, it's not flow, it's friction, and frankly, it feels like filler. Artificial padding to bulk out the runtime. And I think the devs know this. Some levels are split into two clear halves. One section built for secret hunting, the other just pure combat. It's as if the devs are saying, alright, you've done your chores, now here's the fun part. In the early game, it's manageable, but by the end, it wore me down. It all came to a head during a level called Final Battle. Pure fan service, a massive, bombastic set piece meant to reward you for making it this far. Except it's not actually the final level. The real ending comes with Reckoning, a more traditional, combat-focused stage meant to test everything you've learned. Normally I'd be excited for that, but going in, all I could think was, please God, don't let there be any secrets. Of course there are 12. Now the obvious response, when I told myself for most of the game on my first playthrough is, what if you just don't go looking for them? I really thought that might be the answer. Just ignore them, focus on combat. And I tried. I did a full Nightmare playthrough, skipping every collectible I could. But something felt off. The deeper I got, the more cognitive dissonance started to build. Because unfortunately, the part of this game I love the most, the thing that I think the Dark Ages nails better than any entry in this series, directly depends on those secrets. And to explain why, we need to switch gears. I finally get to start praising this game. Okay, Let me start by apologizing. I lied to you earlier. At the start of this video, I implied that Pokemon Emerald wasn't relevant to this analysis. And on the surface that seems true, but honestly, way more than Ratchet and Clank, the Dark Ages reminded me of Pokemon. Let's talk about combat. This game gives you a plethora of tools to use in any given encounter. By the end, there are 16 weapons to choose from, and these are your Pokemon. Argent Denor may have the smallest Pokedex in the franchise, but it makes up for it with distinct, flavorful options. You're not supposed to master every weapon. Instead, you'll naturally find yourself focusing on maybe 5 or 6 favorites, your personal squad, the ones you level up, evolve, and stick with till the end. And just like in Pokemon, there are type matchups. Some tools are super effective against certain enemies, while others aren't the best. But unlike older Doom games, this one doesn't demand optimization. You're free to brute force fights with your favorites. If you're having fun, the game lets you ride that high. Part of the reason this works is because of the game's de-emphasis on ammo as a limiting resource. In previous Doom titles, you had to manage your entire arsenal just to stay stocked. Every fight became a balancing act of ammo efficiency. You couldn't afford to lean too hard on one weapon without running dry. It forced you to master everything just to survive. But in the Dark Ages, that pressure is lifted. Instead of relying solely on scattered pickups or the old chainsaw system, melee combat is now your main way to restore ammo. And it's encouraged frequently. That small change opens up the entire sandbox. If you want to use just the super shotgun for half the game, you absolutely can. You're not punished for leaning into your preferences. So naturally, you build irrational attachments to your loadout, not because it's the best, but because it's yours. And the best part? The game rewards that. The more you invest in a weapon, the more it evolves. Not just statistically, but viscerally. New effects, new synergies, new fun. That loop, enjoy a weapon, upgrade it, enjoy it more, repeat, is the heart of what made the Dark Ages so good for me. It's not just a toolkit. It's a sandbox, and you're invited to sculpt it however you want. And of course, everyone gravitates toward the shield. It's your starter, your Pikachu, your Mudkip, your Snivy. And how you use it determines its type. Is it defensive, aggressive, area control, mobility? It's your call, and that agency is what makes the whole system sing. If I had to nitpick the combat, I do have a couple of small issues. One is that switching weapons can sometimes feel a little too slow and clunky, like your fingers just can't keep up with your brain. That split-second delay, especially when trying to swap mid-fight, occasionally pulls you out of the flow. Also, the super shotgun, even with the weapon reload upgrade, still feels criminally slow. I kept using it anyway, mostly for thematic reasons. It just felt mandatory, even if it wasn't always optimal. That's pretty much it from a weapon standpoint though. The ones I resonated the most were the Flail, the Impaler, the Cycler, the Rocket Launcher, and I guess the Super Shotgun, though not nearly as much as the others. But I'm sure if you played, your priorities and heuristics look meaningfully different. That's kind of the beauty of it. Maybe you also ran around with the Flail and Impaler. They're both a little overtuned, especially early on, but even then, the way you prioritized enemies, the tools you leaned on, the rhythm you found in each encounter, that's your own experience. And that variation is part of what makes this combat system so rich. But this is also where that internal conflict I mentioned earlier really starts to take shape. There's a part of you, maybe the smarter part, that wants to ignore the secrets entirely, because they actively pull you away from the best parts of Doom, the flow, the spectacle, the combat sandbox firing on all cylinders. But the truth is, they're kind of necessary, and that's the frustrating thing. This game hides its best idea behind its worst one. I loved upgrading my tools. It genuinely brought me back to those childhood moments grinding my Pokemon team before the Elite Four, carefully shaping each party member to fit my playstyle, each one mine, each one earned. But to get those upgrades, I had to constantly derail the action to go on a scavenger hunt. Every time the momentum built, it was back to scanning for wolves and hidden walls. The reward was real, but the process tedious. Outside of the combat itself, I can't help but indulge in some praise for this game's presentation. And I don't just mean graphics or polish, I'm talking about the themes, the music, and that utterly ridiculous medieval sci-fi aesthetic that somehow this game absolutely nails. Let's start with the music. Now I should caveat this. There's been controversy between Mick Gordon and id Software, and I'm not comfortable weighing in on that. I'm not legally informed enough to comment responsibly. All I'll say is this: while Mick wasn't involved in the Dark Ages directly, he laid the foundation for what Doom sounds like in this modern era, and that influence is undeniable. The new composers, Finishing Move, clearly took inspiration from his work, and I think they did an amazing job. I've loved the Doom 2016 and Eternal soundtracks since day one, like deeply. I've had Doom workout mixes on rotation at the gym almost every week for the last 2 years. And while I'd still say those edge out the Dark Ages, just slightly, I'm happy to say this game absolutely gave me new tracks to add to the rotation. There are levels in this game where the music kicks in and the moment just elevates. It's electric. It's something I haven't felt from any other game series in recent memory. Do yourself a favor, go into the audio settings and crank the music to 100%. And while we're on audio, let's talk sound design. Not music, I mean the source, the sound effects. Every weapon, every impact, every enemy, every building you crush during the mech sections, it's all satisfyingly crunchy. This is prime real estate for someone like me who thrives off of small dopamine bursts. The audio feedback adds so much weight to every action you take. It's subtle, but I think it enables everything. As for that aesthetic, that wild spaceships and dragons look, it's honestly captivating. The world building feels so much more expansive this time around, and it pulls you in. Having these all-out sieges with heavy armor, floating citadels, flaming maces, and airships in the background. I won't break down every level, but I have to shout out my favorite stretch in the game. A lot of care went into expanding Doom's world, and it really shows in the environments. The new areas are massive and rich with detail, packed with jaw-dropping vistas between all the demon slaying. I know most people expect me to highlight the otherworldly Cthulhu Realm levels, and they are cool, especially from a gameplay perspective, but they weren't as memorable to me as what came earlier. Specifically, chapters 8 through 11 are the high point. You start in a dense dark forest with a colossal beast looming in the background. Then you descend into an underground forge powered by that same creature's heart. From there, it's on to the first proper hell levels, a triumphant return to Doom tradition, and easily the most satisfying stretch for me. Chapter 10 in particular is my favourite, and it all culminates in a brutal Atlan mech section that drives the core fantasy home. You're not just a one-man army, you are the final siege. It's just insane, in the best possible way. If I could go back and show my younger self this game, I think he'd have a much less bleak outlook on high school. That's the power of this game's vibe. It delivers on the Doom fantasy, but it turns it up to 11 with world building and atmosphere. These two elements, music and aesthetic, combine into something unbelievably special. For style, for tone, for sheer atmosphere, this game earns every cent of its $120 price tag. Sure, it only took me around 16 hours to beat, 3 of which were spent looking for those stupid fucking wolves, but those 13 hours of crunchy combat and absurd spectacle, they were an amazing use of my time. From the moment the first trailer dropped, I was all in. I knew from the start of the year that I'd be making a video on this game. There's a very specific craving these Doom games satisfy. id Software's consistency and level of quality should be commended. I wasn't expecting the reception to be so mixed, but I'm happy to be on the positive side of it. The game didn't disappoint me, not even close. There's a feeling I get after finishing something I loved. That bittersweet moment when the credits roll and you realize you'll never get to experience it for the first time again. I demolished this game, and it tasted amazing, left me wonderfully satisfied, though a little sad. Let me be a bit clearer about that Pokemon comparison earlier. It's not one-to-one, it's not meant to be. It's just a lens, a way to talk about something deeper. That thing is nostalgia, the sixth taste. The way we appreciate art, listen to music, taste food, and experience games, it's all shaped by the things that formed us, the stuff we grew up on. Those early exposures carve grooves into us, and they shape how we see everything after. For me, it was Ratchet & Clank and Pokemon. That's the lens I brought into Doom, and that's why it tasted so fucking good to me. That's what this whole video has really been about, how the past flavors the present, and how Doom the Dark Ages hit that craving perfectly. Your lens may be different. Not everyone grew up eating Indian food or playing PS2 games after school. Maybe you were raised on the classic Doom games, and these newer titles feel too much of a departure. That's completely fair. Even though I push back on a lot of major criticism and cosplayed as the game's lawyer, there's plenty of room for people not to enjoy the Dark Ages. I just hope the dislike comes from somewhere honest, and not from farming outrage or turning the game into a proxy war for other grievances. Anyway, after making this absurd comparison between Doom and Pokemon, I'm curious if anyone else felt something similar. What niche comparisons or personal moments did you have playing this game? What did it remind you of? I'd love to hear your stories. After all, I'm just a guy yapping at his monitor for way too long. I need the sanity check. Anyway, that's all from me. Thanks for watching. Peace and love.